All right, we are recording, and now we should be good to go. So our plan for today is we're going to finish going through the 7 criteria for causal arguments. We're most of the way there. We've gotten the first 6 of them done reasonably well. We'll add the 7th one in, say a little bit more about the fallacy of improper appeal to authority, and then use that as our foundation. I'll send you right into your groups to start actually doing some practice analyzing these appeal to authority arguments. We won't finish the group work today. I only gave you sort of a partial version of it. I only gave you 3 problems. There'll be a bunch more that we'll do on Monday, and that'll be fine. So we'll just have most of today and then all of Monday be spent with group activity stuff. And then we'll try to do the rest of chapter 6 on Wednesday is my goal. So that's my plan for the short term. Any questions, comments, anything before we get started? All right, excellent. Then let's do some quick review from last class. We've been talking about appeals to authority. These are arguments of the basic form. You should believe something because it's what an expert or experts say about the topic. The way we're going to evaluate these arguments is not going to be sort of all or nothing. These are sort of inductive arguments, inductive probative arguments in particular. And so there'll be a lot of cases where we'll run into arguments that do violate some of these criteria to some extent, but yet the appeal to authority still works, even if we have some reservations about it. Conversely, there'll be other cases where the appeal to authority sort of collapses in its entirety. So these aren't like the causal criteria we were looking at, where it's sort of a checklist. This is more just a series of concerns, a series of things to think about when you're trying to analyze if someone is or is not an actual expert. And what makes this hard, just to remind ourselves, what makes it hard to evaluate this is that we ourselves are presumably not experts. If we were, we wouldn't actually need to rely upon appeals to authority. If we're relying upon an appeal to authority, it's because we ourselves are not experts. For example, I myself am not a medical doctor, and so I have to trust what doctors tell me, right? And if different doctors say different things, then I'm in trouble, right? Because I myself don't know what the right thing to do is medically. I'm relying upon other people to tell me, right? People who should be experts, and these arguments will work. They'll give me good reason to believe that the conclusion is true if the person speaking really is an expert. So the first thing to consider in the course of these, you need to make sure that the sort of topic that's being discussed is one that admits of expertise in the first place. And even if it does admit of expertise, how much expertise does it seem to admit? There's things like, for example, music, where we do seem to think that there are experts. There are people who know way more about music than others. And yet it still might not be enough of expertise in that field possible that I'll just blindly accept that someone says the Beatles' White Album is the best album ever. Or maybe I have more confident in music expertise, right? It depends on precisely what degree of expertise do I think this field actually admits of. Next, right? Is there agreement within the field about the topic that the expert is speaking about? So let's say we're talking about whether or not antibiotics are an effective treatment for the Black Plague, right? Do all, or if not all, that might be too high of a standard, do almost all, do an overwhelming majority of experts in the field agree with what the person is saying? If they do, then yeah, then that seems to be a sort of a settled topic, that all the experts are in agreement. If the experts really aren't in agreement on the topic, though, that sort of minimizes the impact of the appeal. It has less force because the experts don't all agree. And if there's widespread disagreement, then it just isn't really a topic that's settled. It's not a topic that expertise can sort of reliably settle for us. Is this expert actually relevant in the relevant area? Right, we talked about last class about how people sort of are prone to ask athletes about cars or to ask, Nobel Prize winners in biology about political questions, where indeed those people just aren't really, they might be experts in a subject matter, but they're not experts in the relevant subject matter for the topic being discussed. And then even if someone is the relevant kind of expert, are they the most specialized kind of expert possible, right? A specialist in the removal of malignant tumors of the spinal column is a far more reliable expert than the general practitioner on the question of what should I do about my spinal tumor. Even though the general practitioner is indeed still an expert in the field of medicine, he or she would be less authoritative than the specialist. Fourth, has the expert had a chance to review relevant information, right? We always speak more intelligently about things when we've had a chance to think about them. If we're asked to speak sort of off the cuff without having given it much thought, our thoughts aren't as well formed, right? So I'm an expert in ancient philosophy. If you asked me an ancient philosophy question, I'd probably give you a better response to your question if I had had more time to think about it. If there's a new question that I hadn't really thought about before, I can try to give you an answer, but it wouldn't be as authoritative as if I had had time to stop and reflect upon it. The one we ended last class with, right? Is the expert trying to avoid being inappropriately influenced by biases or conflict of interest? Again, it's important to remember here, no one is actually free of bias or conflict of interest. That's just not how this works. Every human being has various sorts of perspectives, and indeed this is really valuable. What matters in terms of these appeal to authority is, why is the person saying what they're saying? Are they saying what they're saying because of their expertise? Or are they saying it because of the bias or because of the conflict of interest? If they're saying it because of the bias or because of the conflict of interest, that's not because of expertise, they're not a real authority. Even if they're making the effort, though, to avoid being influenced in a negative fashion by their biases, if they're trying and making the effort to speak on the basis of their expertise, even if they do have biases, then what they say has more weight to it. Right. And again, one thing we talked about last class, frequently this takes the form of just disclosing your conflicts of interest if you have them. That just shows that you're thinking about it, you're aware of the ways in which the conflict of interest could be biasing you, but you are trying to put that off to one side. Right? So again, this is sort of aspirational. We want our experts to make this effort. They don't actually have to be impartial, because that's not possible. You can't actually be impartial about something. This superficially resembles the ad hominem fallacy, right? We're sort of rejecting an argument in some cases because of some of the circumstances of the person involved. But this is only a superficial resemblance. In fact, the expert actually is directly relevant to the argument that's being made. The person who makes the argument matters to the correctness of the argument, because the expert really kind of is the argument, right? Basically, what these appeal to authorities boil down to is trust me. Right? Believe what I say because I'm the one saying it. So I actually really do matter. I, sort of as an expert, am the premise of my argument. My expertise is. If my expertise is the thing that's being called into question because of my circumstances, then it's not actually committing the fallacy. Lastly, we have this idea of peer review. Have the claims of the expert been subjected to peer review? Have other experts in the field analyzed these claims and endorsed them? Or at least gave them the sort of stamp of approval? This isn't always possible. Peer review is really only something that exists in academic contexts, really. I mean, there's some other contexts where it can occur, but it mostly is an academic context. But if it's an area where peer review is possible, at least, peer review always strengthens the claim that's being made. All right, so we'll pause for a second here. That was just a review of what we've been talking about the past couple days. Does anyone have any questions about any of those first six? We still have one more to add, but before we add the new one, any questions about any of those first six? Good for now, at least. All right, perfect. Then let's add in our last criteria, and then let's briefly talk about the fallacy of the appeal to inappropriate authority, and then I'll send you into your groups. All right. So the last criteria, can the expert give a persuasive, if not technical, but not technical, explanation of what they are saying? So here would be an example. I mean, just think about this quite every daily. I think you'll get the gist of this really closely. Which mechanic are you going to trust? So here's two examples. Example one, your car needs a lot of work. Just take my word for it. Or option 2, your car needs a lot of work. Your brakes have started to wear down a little bit and need to be replaced. Because of safety concerns. Right? Just right off the bat, what mechanic is more trustworthy? Right? Which one are you more likely to pay large sums of money to? And my hope, at least my guess, is that you're all way more likely to trust the person who can actually tell you, right? That the first guy sounds like he's just kind of scamming me, right? Like, oh yeah, there's a lot of work. It's really complicated. Lots of work needed. You just have to take my word for it. I mean, that sounds kind of like someone who's just trying to pull a fast one on me, right? The expert should be able to give me some kind of explanation of, in this case, why are the repairs needed? What's the purpose of the repairs? Now, this non-technical explanation isn't the real explanation. Of what's actually going on. Because if I was actually capable of actually understanding what was going on with my brakes, I wouldn't need to go to a mechanic in the first place. Have any of you either taken any sort of physics class or just maybe watched a YouTube video or something that was trying to explain general relativity, Einstein's theory? Right? The metaphor people always use for the bending of space-time, they'll always like show you this where you like put a bowling ball on a bed and it causes the bed to indent. And this is sort of as a metaphor that's supposed to help you think a little bit about what's going on with general relativity. Now, all that's completely false, though, right? Like general relativity, the curvature of space-time through gravitational distortions and mass distortions really isn't very much actually like the putting the bowling ball on the bed. It's just a metaphor that's supposed to help the non-specialist gain some rough idea of what it is that the specialist is talking about. It's not the real explanation. What's the real explanation? A bunch of incredibly complicated mathematics. Right, that's the real explanation. And if you could actually understand all that mathematics, you wouldn't need to take the expert's word on it. You yourself would be an expert. But because we're appeals to authority, I have to rely upon the expert. I'm not going to actually expect the expert to give me the real explanation. Right? This is just one that can be understood by the average person. And that's what I mean when I'm calling this a persuasive. Right? It's one that works well enough, even if it's not even technically speaking accurate or correct. It gives me at least some rough idea of, for example, in this case, what's going on with my car, even though the specifics are perhaps beyond my ability to understand or comprehend. Right. But we have to be really careful with this 7th criteria. One unfortunate thing about the fact that we ourselves are not experts is that we can't actually evaluate between different competing explanations. Just because someone can give this kind of sort of simplified account, that actually does not make them an expert. And indeed, lots of non-experts can give simplified accounts too. Let me share a little story from ancient philosophy. So Plato, who's the guy I specialize on, he's the guy I mostly work on, he's really concerned with these appeal to authority arguments. He thinks they're both incredibly important in human life, but also they're super hard to get right. They're super hard to do accurately. And so he tells this story in one of his dialogues about a man named Gorgias. And Gorgias' thing is that he's this expert speaker. And his claim, and it's really actually a disturbing claim because it's probably true, is that he can go and compete with doctors, and he himself is not a doctor, but he can be more persuasive about medical matters than the doctors themselves are because he's such a good public speaker. And he's more persuasive than engineers about engineering matters because he's a good public speaker. He's just really good at persuading people of things. And Gorgias he fully just admits, I don't actually know anything about what I'm talking about, right? I actually don't know anything at all about medicine. The reason people will listen to me isn't because I know what I'm talking about, it's because I'm a good speaker, I'm persuasive. So we have to be really careful. The actual truth usually is way more complicated than we would have guessed. Really simple, easy explanations sound good to us, but they're not indicative of any sort of expertise. The expert should be able to give us a simple explanation, but just giving one is not indicative of expertise, and indeed the truth might actually be rather complex. Pseudoscience, so people who are basically trying to scam you into thinking they're experts, usually to sell you something, they're really good at giving really simple sorts of stories about why their magic elixir is going to cure all of your problems. And indeed, the simplicity of their explanation should indeed actually make us even suspicious of it, right? So experts should be able to give these kinds of accounts, but that's not enough to be an expert. Go more, don't just stop with that last criteria. This is just, we trust people more if they can actually give us the account than we trust the person who can't give the account. Right. Any question with that last criteria? It's a really important one, and it's a place where things can go wrong, though, if you take it too seriously. So any questions with that number 7? The criteria in general, do you feel reasonable with all of them? Do all of them make rough sense to start with? All right, good. Let's do one last thing before I put you into your groups. So I want to actually talk about the fallacy of appeal to improper authority. This fallacy occurs whenever there's an egregious or obvious problem with what the authority is saying. When the authority just isn't an authority at all, right? It's someone presenting themselves as if they're an expert when they're actually not an expert. So here would be some examples of when this could occur. Right? Someone talking in a domain that doesn't admit of any expertise. Here's another one. Someone talking in a field where there is complete disagreement about the topic. Or another one. Someone who has no relevant expertise whatsoever. For example, an actor talking about medical matters, right? Actors might well be experts in something, but they're not in any sense expert in anything relevant or related to the topic, right? Or again, right? the expert, someone who is completely untrustworthy. Perhaps because they're a paid spokesman. And so as a result of that, there's no reason to treat what they're saying as coming from any kind of expertise. So all of these examples are examples that do indeed violate one of the criteria, but they don't just sort of violate it and so cause us to be suspicious of the expert. They violate the criteria to such an overwhelming extent that there's no reason to take this person seriously at all. That's what we mean by the fallacy. The fallacy occurs when you have no reason to actually take what the person is saying seriously. The person speaking just isn't an expert. But there are going to be other instances where the criteria get violated. And instead of committing the fallacy, it will just make us more suspicious or more reticent to fully accept the claim. If I have a conflict of interest but disclose it, for example, right, you still might want to listen to what I say, but you'll be more suspicious than you otherwise would be. And this is so maybe if I'm a doctor, for example, maybe you get a second opinion. You don't discount me altogether. The authority is if you just discounted what I had to say altogether. You wouldn't discount what I said altogether, but you would be more suspicious than otherwise. Right? Remember, with inductive arguments in general, they're not all or nothing. There can indeed be stronger arguments. So an expert who doesn't have any relevant conflicts of interest, they are a stronger expert. They are more likely I should give more weight to the conclusion. But someone who does indeed have a disclosed conflict of interest, but otherwise is in good state, they still might give me reasons to believe the conclusion, and it still might be a strong inductive argument, just not as strong of an inductive argument if the conflict of interest wasn't been present. So on the problems that I'm going to ask you to look at in terms of the group work, make sure you keep that distinction in mind. I'm going to sort of ask you how everything you're going to look at today does indeed violate one of these criteria, but part of what you need to figure out is how serious is the violation. Is the violation so serious that it actually commits a fallacy of improper appeal to authority, or does it just a reason to be a little bit more suspicious of what the expert's saying, and you'll need to sort of justify why, justify your answer a little bit. So that's what I'll have you do today. We have 3 problems. There's something wrong with all of them. Each of these appeals to authority violates one of the criteria, so you need to figure out what criteria is being violated, why is it being violated, and then how severe of a problem is it? Does it commit the fallacy, or is it just cause for suspicion, or to be more suspicious than we otherwise would be? So that's what planning for the group work. Any last questions or thoughts or anything? So we have someone who is asking, what if an expert gives testimony that goes against their conflict of interest or bias? Yeah, that probably does make their statement more credible, right? So like let's say I own an X-ray machine, right? I'm a doctor and I own an X-ray machine. And I say, yeah, so it would be great for me if you needed an X-ray, but you know what? I just don't think you need it, right? Yeah, that actually would give me even more credibility because, yeah, I mean, I actually have an incentive to make you get unnecessary X-rays. So if I'm saying you don't need one, that would indeed be more evidence to think you don't need one. So yeah, someone going against their conflict of interest or bias, that probably does, other things equal, at least strengthen their testimony or strengthen their expertise. That seems right to me. Any other questions before we get started? All right.